the Great Glen Way, 80 miles from Fort William to Inverness in 7 days in April 2024. The Great Glen Way is a relatively tame trail when compared to many of the others that I have done. After I finished walking the West Highland Way in 2013, I rather dismissively ignored the natural continuation along what appeared to me to be a rather flat and boring straight line along the ancient Highland fault line that runs between Fort William and Inverness. Many years previously, I had driven along the northern shore of Loch Ness in the worst sort of weather that Scotland can throw at you, and decided that it was a part of Scotland that didn't need to be revisited. Once again, how wrong could I be? So, just over 10 years later, and with many wonderful trails under my feet, I decided that I needed to tackle the Great Glen Way, mainly so that I could say that I had walked all the national trails in England and Wales, and Scotland's 4 original Great Trails. Since 2010, these have grown to 29, and the Great Glen would be my second to last trail before reaching the gold at the end of the rainbow. I didn't have high expectations as I set off from Fort William on a bright but rather chilly April day, but I quickly discovered that this is a very worthwhile trail, rich in history, with some splendid mountain scenery along its course. It became all the more rewarding because I opted to take all the high-level alternatives when available, giving me some stunning views and a great extra workout. It is not for nothing that vast numbers of tourists and walkers from all over the world visit this area and return home enriched by their experience. I met some of them on my walk. This is a social trail which presents many opportunities for chatting to fellow walkers, but having said that, I still spent most of my days walking without seeing a soul. The distances covered are large enough to ensure that the Great Glen Way is not a motorway for walkers. I ended up walking over 100 miles due to the high-level alternatives and the fact that my guidebook always grossly underestimates the daily distances. Day 1, Fort William to Gairlochie, 13 miles. Here I am at the start of my journey in Fort William. On my way with great views towards Ben Nevis in the background. The start of the Caledonian Canal, which links Loch Lochy, Loch Oich and Loch Ness, and has 29 lochs along its entire length, connecting the Scottish west and east coasts. The Great Glen is a remarkable geographical feature, running along an ancient Highland fault line and the most prominent fault in Britain. The Commando Memorial at Speen Bridge, where I stayed on my first night. Amazingly, this memorial is depicted in a book which, at the time of my walk, I had been translating for a Norwegian writer about the young Norwegian commandos who trained here during the Second World War, after having escaped from Norway when it was invaded by the Germans. They went on to fight at the Battle of Walcheren in Holland with No. 10 Inter-Allied Commando, and many of them never returned. It's a very moving story, and I actually had no idea that I would be walking past this memorial until I got there. Such a coincidence. Ben Nevis and Unoc Moor can be seen in the background. View of Ben Nevis and Unoc Moor from my B&B in Speen Bridge. Day 2, Gairlochie to the Lagan Lochs, 16 miles. Great views across Loch Lochy to the Nevis Range. Loch Lochy has a monster too, called Lizzie. Local people took great delight in telling me some of the numerous local jokes that they have about these monsters. These jokes invariably involve things like kilts and unmentionable parts of the body. Loch Lochy. I was amazed at the tenacity of this little birch tree. Do bears shit in the woods? I had the delightful company of Trevor, a homeless tramp, on the last 3 miles of this stage. He told me that he suffers from claustrophobia and schizophrenia and manages it without taking medication by walking the footpaths of Britain. He is unable to live indoors, receives no benefits, and supports himself by begging and doing odd jobs. He gave me a very interesting insight into another, rather harsh, alternative way of living. Day 3, Lagan Locks to Fort Augustus, 16.5 miles. The promise of otters as I crossed the River Garry at Invergarry, but they were just mocking me again. En route to Fort Augustus along the River Oik. This is probably the most boring piece of trail that I've ever walked. 3 miles of straight, flat, hard concrete along the side of the Caledonian Canal before Fort Augustus. One of the locks at Fort Augustus, which was heaving with tourists and Nessie paraphernalia. I dread to think what it must be like in the summer if it's this busy at the end of April. Day 4, Fort Augustus to Invermoriston, 11.5 miles. This was supposed to be my short day, but I decided to take the high-level alternative, which was definitely worth it because the views over Loch Ness were fantastic. The trees in the forests were swathed in beautiful lichen. Wood sorrel was flowering everywhere in the forests. Wood sorrel is one of the plants known as shamrock and dedicated to St. Patrick, who used its trifoliate leaves to illustrate the Holy Trinity. It has traditionally had many medicinal uses, but because it contains oxalic acid, overindulgence is not advised. And everything was covered in beautiful mosses and lichens. It felt like I was walking through a fairy tale landscape, with trolls and elves lurking behind the stones and trees. Loch Ness. The smell of felled timber was lovely here. The bridge at Invermoriston, where I arrived in a violent hailstorm. Actually, I was very lucky throughout my walk because this hailstorm was the only time that I got rained on. So this is Invermoriston. And that's the bridge. Really running waterfall. I'm in the little summer house, which sort of is built overhanging the river here. It's quite precarious, but pretty stunning. More waterfalls at Invermoriston. And there's my trail back to the hotel where I'm staying tonight. On the trail to the waterfalls in Invermoriston. My lunch spot near the waterfalls in Invermoriston. St. Columba's Well in Invermoriston. The sign next to it says the following: "It is believed that a well or spring has been on this site since early Pictish times. Until the 6th century AD, the water was considered to be poisonous, causing boils and ulcers to appear if splashed on the skin. Then St. Columba, on his way to visit Brude, a great king of the Picts, drove out the evil spirits around the well and blessed for all time the water coming from it. The water was then clean and pure and was said to have great curative powers. It may even have been the source for what is now Loch Ness." The Glenmoriston Arms Hotel, where I stayed in Invermoriston. The little coffee shop just down the road was open when I arrived, and full of walkers who I had met on the trail, so I had a great social time chatting to them all and swapping stories. Day 5. Invermoriston to Drumnadrochit, 17 miles. Leaving Invermoriston on a lovely misty morning. I met a local chap walking a dog who filled me in on all the local lore, including tales about a black panther which was rumoured to roam the area. Apparently, large prints had been seen in the snow there on several occasions during the winter. I told him that I wished he hadn't told me that, but we decided that it was probably not a threat because, so far, it hadn't snacked on any walkers on the Great Glen Way, or anyone else for that matter. I never saw the panther, or Nessie, or Lizzie, the Loch Lochy monster, either. They are obviously all as elusive as otters. Climbing up to the high-level route above Invermoriston on a misty morning. The View Catcher, a sculpture in wood and stone on the high-level route above Invermoriston. Primroses on the trail. The forests were heaving with them. Spring was still 2 to 3 weeks behind spring in the south. Primroses are mainly used today as an expectorant and tonic for the respiratory and nervous systems. They also contain salicylic acid, which is one of the main ingredients of aspirin. So here's a much better viewpoint further up the trail. Look at that. That's Loch Ness. It's still a nice morning, but rain is forecast later. The centre of Drumnadrochit, where I stayed the night. My B&B was selling these lovely locally handcrafted tartan nesses. How could I resist them? Nessie mania rules in this area. Day 6, Drumnadrochit to Blackfold, 16.5 miles. I took the high-level alternative again, leaving Drumnadrochit with a view across to Urquhart Castle on Loch Ness. I walked through a lot of forests like this, and this. Tolkien-esque bench on the high-level route. Hut circle sight as I was descending from the high-level route. The hut roof on the inside. The hut circle site. Self-explanatory sign. The trees in the Abriachan forest were literally dripping with lichen. I stopped off at this eco-cafe in the Abriachan forest. A fellow walker had told me that they serve the most amazing food there for lunch. Since I had already eaten my lunch, I just had a great chat with the owners, who told me that they had been living there off-grid for the last 25 years. The Eco Cafe. larch flowers and cones in the Abriacan forest. Day 7, Blackfold to Inverness, 10 miles. The first few miles of my final day on the trail passed through forest scenery like this. Finally, a monster on the trail along the River Ness in Inverness. The end of the trail in Inverness. This was such a social trail, and I met loads of Americans, Germans and other nationalities on my journey. Most people, like me, were walking from southwest to northeast. I told one of the Americans that I was starting to feel like a foreigner in my own country, and he said that they might all be moving over here if Trump gets in at the next election. Lessons learnt. Nessie and Lizzie are obviously masters of camouflage, because I saw no signs of them during the 7 days of my walk. The Great Glen Way is far from boring. The Great Glen Way is a great trail for meeting people from all over the world. Drumnadrochit is one of the coldest places in the UK during the winter. My B&B host told me that last winter the temperature dropped to -17 degrees centigrade.